Well, you can do another test. You have 100 patients here, you give them acupuncture. You have another 100 patients over here, you give them fake acupuncture, but this time the fake acupuncture means that the needles go back into the handle. So you insert the needle into the skin, but instead of the needle going into the skin, it goes back up into the handle. So the patient feels some pressure, feels some pain, thinks they're having acupuncture, when in fact their skin is not being pierced at all. And again, you compare the two groups. When you compare the two groups, there's very, very little difference. There's a placebo response here, a placebo response here. It's very debatable. I say there have been many trials. Some trials show a slight benefit in this group. Some trials show no significant benefit in this group compared to this group. So for me, the jury is out. Data is always open to interpretation if it's slightly hazy. For me, I think it's probably all placebo effect. Others would say there is something there, but I don't think they'd be able to argue that it's very convincing evidence or that it's very positive, very significant clinically. But what are the risks? If there is a benefit and it's small, what are the risks? Well, about 10% of patients experience minor bleeding, minor bruising, pain or dizziness. There are rare exceptions of infections and rare examples of organs being punctured, but those are so rare that we could probably just ignore them. So what you have is possibly some benefit, some minor side effects, and it's a very fine balance. But that's kind of as good as it gets for acupuncture. If you see many high street acupuncturists, you'll find claims that go way beyond pain and nausea. You'll see claims for heart conditions, eczema, asthma, all sorts of things. For those conditions, there's no good evidence that acupuncture is effective. And yet you still have these risks. So we started moving from one end of the spectrum, which was positive, to the middle of the spectrum, possibly even towards the negative end of the spectrum. And I think I put chiropractic in a similar sort of bracket. For back pain, there's some evidence that it may work. It's borderline, but back problems are notoriously difficult, so chiropractors may have something to offer. What are the risks? Well, pain, bruising, possibly severe risks of stroke if the top of the neck is damaged. That's controversial, but it hasn't been properly studied, I don't think. And if it hasn't been properly studied, then we have to be aware that there is a potential risk. So the balance there is very fine. But if we move beyond back problems, so things like asthma and colic, in ear infections, there's no good evidence, as far as I'm concerned, that chiropractors can help with those conditions. The risks are still what as I've already stated, and so there I think we're very much in a negative part of the spectrum. And that's the article that I was writing about last year, and that's why I was being sued by the British Chiropractic Association. I certainly don't mind you mentioning. In fact, it's a matter of great pride. There are other therapies that are very clearly negative for me. Things like Hopi ear candling. It's very bizarre. When I was telling somebody about this earlier today, they hadn't come across it. The idea is you put a hollow wax tube in your ear and you light the top of it, and it creates an updraft which clears the ear, removes wax, sharpens the senses, and helps in various different ways. No evidence that it works at all. No sign of any updraft. There is a wax that you find at the end, but that's not wax removed from your ear. That's wax deposited by the candle. The risks, again, are quite real here. Just burning parts of the ear, damaging the inner ear. There are even cases, I think 2 cases, of house fires caused by Hopi ear candling, which actually led to death. And that's why Canada's now banned Hopi ear candling, and hopefully other countries will follow. But finally, there's a third group in the spectrum, which is things like homeopathy, reflexology, Reiki, crystal therapy. Now, as far as I'm concerned, these therapies are not backed by any evidence at all to show that they work. They're biologically implausible. There's no universal energy that we know of that could make Reiki work. There's no active ingredient in much of homeopathy that would mean that homeopathy could possibly work. There's no meridians or chi that would help reflexology work. So these are biologically implausible therapies often with no mechanism that we know of, no active ingredient, no evidence to back them up, and often lots of evidence to show quite the opposite. But if there's no evidence that they can show benefit, then surely there's no evidence that they can do harm. So maybe we're in a neutral situation with those therapies. I would argue that they can actually still do harm. With something like homeopathy, I got into homeopathy because I'd heard of people who were going to tropical countries using homeopathy to protect them against malaria. Now, homeopathy won't protect you against malaria, and there are cases of people coming back from tropical countries with malaria, followed by severe organ failure, because they thought that homeopathy would protect them. So here you have an example of an ineffective treatment replacing what is an effective treatment, i.e. conventional medicine. There's the cost harm that's being done. These therapies are expensive, so people are paying for therapies that are backed by no benefit. There are odd side effects that you might not imagine. My co-author, Professor Edzard Ernst, did a survey in England of chiropractors and homeopaths to see what advice they would give to parents over vaccinating their children. More than half of chiropractors did not encourage parents to vaccinate their children, and over 95% of homeopaths did not encourage parents to vaccinate their children. So, again, when we start moving towards these therapies, there are all sorts of unexpected side effects that are potentially very harmful. And more tragic cases that have happened recently in terms of homeopathy that people in Australia are more aware of than I am, I'm sure. The only thing I haven't mentioned, and I'll just finish with this point, is the placebo effect, which I mentioned at the beginning. When I say that homeopathy or Reiki has no effect, I'm not saying it doesn't have a placebo effect. It probably does have a placebo effect. And so some people may argue that in this risk-benefit, we should include the placebo effect. Because if it's the placebo effect that's helping people, that's important in its own right. I would argue that's not the case. I would argue that if I'm going to trigger a placebo effect in somebody, I've got to make them believe in something that isn't actually true. As a homeopath, I might believe in it, but it's not true. The evidence doesn't back it up. So I have to engender that same false belief in the patient. And the bigger the false belief, the bigger the lie, the bigger the placebo effect. Do we really want to go down that road? And if homeopaths and batch flower remedy salespeople can sell placebos, then would we allow big pharmaceuticals to sell us placebos? Well, no, why not? Why should they put so much money into research, or so little money into research, when they can put even more money into marketing and just sell us placebos? Every so often that turns out to be the case, and there's a big scandal and the product's withdrawn. But what's an exception in big pharmaceuticals is par for the course in many alternative therapies. Also, it's important to remember you don't need to have a placebo to get a placebo effect. If I take a homeopathic pill for hay fever, I get a placebo effect. If I take an antihistamine, I get the specific effect of the antihistamine plus a placebo effect as a bonus. So just giving people placebos is shortchanging the patient. And last of all, no placebo effect is going to protect anybody from malaria. So we get to the very serious end of conditions where the placebo effect just isn't going to help at all. And one very, very last thing to remember, a potential side effect of homeopathy. I haven't really explained what homeopathy is, but the idea is the more and more and more diluted the remedy, the more powerful it is. And in fact, homeopathic remedies are so diluted that the final remedy typically contains no active ingredient at all, not a single molecule of active ingredient. But because it's so diluted, it's so powerful. But this opens us up to the risk that if we accidentally forget to take our homeopathic remedy, might we die of an overdose? Thank you very much.
Simon, thank you very much for that very clear articulation of the issue. As I'm sure you know, in Australia, the public and private health insurance funds support a vast array of alternative medicines. And there's a nettle that needs to be grasped there to separate the wheat from the chaff, if I can mix the agriculture. So there is a real issue for us. Our last speaker is Alex Wodak. He's Director of Alcohol and Drug Services at St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney since 1982. And for those of you who know the location of St Vincent's in Sydney, you'll know this is the epicentre, at least the visible epicentre in Sydney of the drugs and HIV scene. Alex is an outspoken commentator on the impact of alcohol and drugs, and he's a leading reformer of drug laws in this country. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to make some brief comments about the major drug groups, each of them, and I'll spend most of my time talking about the so-called psychoactive drugs, that is, the drugs that affect our mood and our feelings. But I will say something about the therapeutic drugs as well. Let's start with tobacco because, and arguably that's, in terms of cost to the community, in terms of deaths, it's our biggest drug problem. It's only a little bit more than half a century since we first had really solid evidence of how serious a health problem tobacco is, and this came from the studies of Richard Dole in Britain in 1953. And what followed in Australia was a decade or more where the public health activists really started mounting a campaign to try and get some government attention onto this problem. And it took quite a while, but it's very important to realise that the response started outside government. It started amongst wonderful public health activists who we should all be very grateful to. And the result is that today Australia enjoys the third lowest smoking prevalence levels in the world after Singapore and Sweden. This is really a considerable achievement, and the smoking levels are still going down. In New South Wales, only 13% of the population are now daily smokers, and it's still falling. So how did David defeat the Goliath of the public health, defeat the Goliath of the tobacco industry? And the answer was it took a long time, and it was very slow chipping away. And it was really done without any draconian, punitive responses. There was attention given to things that would reduce the demand for tobacco, increasing the price, advertising bans, and then the bans on smoking in public places. And also there were some reductions on the supply of tobacco in terms of reducing outlets. But all in all, there are a lot of lessons to be learned in terms of public health and public policy generally. And I think one of the lessons is how effective we can be with drugs like tobacco when we proceed through legal channels and also when policy is based on solid evidence. Alcohol is a huge problem, and there's no doubt about this. We've got a very good idea of the immensity of the health, social and economic costs, and Fran has mentioned the economic costs. But millions of Australians every year are on the receiving end of verbal or sometimes even physical abuse from an intoxicated person presumably intoxicated with alcohol. And we know this from a national survey that the government carries out every few years. So social costs are also very high. We have a real problem grappling with this, although it's not realised that we've done quite well in the last quarter century. Alcohol consumption's been reduced by 25% from almost 10 litres per person per year in the early 1980s, and we're now at about 7.5 litres per person per year. And there's very close correlation between how much a community drinks and what sort of level of problems they have. And the reason there's a close connection between that is that the 10% heaviest drinkers in the community account for 50% of all the alcohol that's consumed. So minus those 10% heavy drinkers, the alcohol beverage industry would be in a lot of financial trouble. And that means that when we try and do something about alcohol problems, we really have to try and reduce the amount of high-risk drinking in the community. And the things that really work are increasing the price of alcohol, not draconian increases, small increases, and restricting the availability of alcohol, reducing the number of outlets and restricting the conditions under which alcohol is sold. And the alcohol road crash death countermeasures are also one of the most effective things that we can do with alcohol. Advertising bans may play a role. The evidence on that isn't great. And although there's good evidence that treatment has benefits, there's no evidence that treatment has benefit at the population level as yet. So we've got a good idea about what works, and we've also got a good idea about what doesn't work. And unfortunately, the reason we make so little progress with alcohol is that governments around the world insist on doing what doesn't work, like mass education campaigns, and don't do the things that do work. And this is a problem we also have with the illicit drugs area, that what's popular isn't effective and what's effective isn't popular. And one of the reasons that this situation prevails in alcohol and also with alcohol is that the alcohol beverage industry is very powerful, very wealthy, and donates generously to governing and opposition parties. There may be some of you who believe that, and you might be right, that the alcohol beverage industry does this for philanthropic purposes and it likes to prop up the democratic system. Perhaps there are other reasons as well, but leave that as it is. Let me say a few words about prescription drugs, and I'll start off by talking about the therapeutic drugs. We're very lucky in Australia to have the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. It's over half a century old, and this is a system under which a very high-level committee, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, advises federal cabinet, doesn't advise the health department, advises federal cabinet about which drugs should be subsidised and which drugs shouldn't. And it subsidises those drugs which are shown on evidence to be beneficial to the community. And this allows Australia, the Australian government, to be a monopsony buyer, that is a single purchaser, of a huge number of drugs, and that drives down the price that Australians pay for their therapeutic drugs. And that's terribly important. The system's been copied by a number of other countries and is widely admired around the world. And there was a major improvement to this system a few years ago where an economic subcommittee was tagged onto this, and nowadays we not only choose which drugs to subsidise according to how effective they are and how safe they are, but also how cost-effective they are. And that's terribly important. It's a wonderful system, and unfortunately the system has been undermined during the previous government, the Howard government, and the way that happened was when the bilateral trade agreement was negotiated between Australia and the United States. No surprise that the US pharmaceutical industry was very keen to undermine that system that I've just told you about. It's not yet clear how effective the US pharmaceutical industry has been in undermining that system, but it's certainly something to watch. I think it's also worth mentioning how important national and international pharmaceutical regulation is, and we first realised how important that is really around the world when we woke up to the disaster that had been caused by thalidomide. And that put a real shock through the pharmaceutical regulatory system around the world, including Australia. And so really in Australia and other countries, new drugs don't get introduced unless and until there is evidence that they are effective and safe, and in Australia these days that they're also cost effective. So all new drugs are assumed to be ineffective and unsafe until proven otherwise. One of the areas that's of growing concern in Australia is the sustained-release prescription opioids, drugs like OxyContin and MS-Contin. And my colleagues and I have just written a report for the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. You'll find it on their website on this issue. And unfortunately, Australia's following the trends that have developed in the United States. We're about a decade behind the United States. In this case, it's a good thing to be a decade behind the United States. About 10 years ago, deaths from drug overdose from prescription opioids overtook deaths from overdose from heroin and cocaine in the United States, and that gap has been widening since the year 2000. We're now consuming prescription opioids at the same level, about 60 kilograms per million of oxycodone per year, as the United States was 10 years ago. So this is an area where we really need to develop some policy fairly rapidly, and we've made a number of recommendations in this policy. It's not just deaths from drug overdose the United States is grappling with from the prescription opioids, the sort of problems that Heath Ledger and perhaps Michael Jackson, no relation to this, exemplify, but we're also seeing in the United States increasing requests for help for people struggling with prescription opioid problems. We also have a very significant problem with benzodiazepines in terms of prescription drugs, particularly the drugs, the benzodiazepines that come on quickly, quick onset, and that have a short duration. They're the drugs that generally cause us a lot of problems. There's been a lot of progress with the illicit drug area, nationally and internationally, and we now have harm reduction is now the global mainstream drug policy around the world. Of course, there are a few outliers to that. We still have a way to go, but within the UN system, there is now very strong support from the World Health Organization, from UNAIDS, from UNICEF, from the World Bank, and from Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria. So there are a lot of organisations now that are very strongly supporting harm reduction. You wouldn't know it from the debate in Australia, but internationally it's now really the mainstream. And what's really changed in the last 6 months internationally is the growing support now also for drug law reform. That debate is mirroring the debate we had previously about harm reduction. And there's increasing recognition now of the need to change our drug laws. In fact, on May the 7th this year, Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary-General, in his statement on HIV/AIDS, said, paragraph 16, that we need to decriminalise the laws against same-sex sex work, and also illicit drugs. So that's a very powerful statement from UN Secretary-General, and you'll find that on the internet if you wish to look for it. You also found it in my speech on Sunday. So there's a lot of difficulty in changing policy in this area because what has worked so well for so long as a political strategy, the tough on drugs, war on drugs type approach, has failed so dismally as a public policy. But because it has helped governments, helped people to get elected, it's been sustained. It's a difficult argument to make because people like me are arguing on the basis of evidence and advocating policies that sound counterintuitive, whereas the people advocating war on drugs type approaches are advocating a policy not backed by evidence, but it sounds as though intuitively it ought to be right. But on May the 14th this year, the new US drug czar in the Wall Street Journal called for an end to the use of the term war on drugs, and there are all sorts of things going on now in the United States. Of course, we've got President Obama, who had said in the Senate that the war on drugs was an utter failure. We have the governor of California now calling for a debate on legalization of cannabis. So major things are now happening around the world. That debate really hasn't started again in Australia, but I'm sure it will. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that very thought-provoking talk. Obviously, we've got some very deep issues here, how healthcare in our community is organised and provided, and the networks behind that, and the inbuilt need of humans for external support to get through life, to find props to get them going. Now, in the next short section of this, I wonder if we could have a discussion with the panel, between the panel, if there are any questions that panel members would like to ask each other, or any topics. Yes, Fran.
Can I ask Simon a question? I heard your interview on Radio National this morning where you were talking with Stephen, someone who is a professor of complementary medicine, and he made the point about the nature of evidence and efficacy of drugs. And he said, well, if patients perceive that something is effective, he was basically saying, isn't that a valid form of evidence? So what do you take as evidence, and how do you evaluate that patient perception?
I think there's a hierarchy of evidence from one-off case reports, and you get a few more case reports, and you sort of think, well, hang on, there's something interesting here, and then you suddenly do a clinical trial, and that's an interesting result, and you expand it, and you do more clinical trials, and you take a systematic review, and you come to some kind of conclusion. Now, the conclusion in terms of colic, for chiropractors treating colic, for me is negative. Been 2 clinical trials. The bigger, better one shows no effect. The poorer, smaller one is misleading, I think, in its result. Now, patients, a couple are desperate, their child's got colic, they're screaming, weeks have gone by, there's no help from the doctor, no help from any other process. Then they go and see the chiropractor after a few weeks, and the chiropractor says, give me a month, and I'm sure we'll see some benefit. Now, the nature of colic is that within a month, the child is probably going to get better. They're at their worst anyway. And so, at the end of a month, the child's feeling better, the baby's feeling better, the parents are feeling better, the chiropractor's feeling better. And richer. And word spreads, and suddenly this is what mothers and fathers ought to be doing. Now, that's where I think that idea breaks down, is that the perception of one parent in one situation can be highly misleading. You go and see a homeopath with hay fever, the next day you feel better. Was it the homeopath, or is it a change in the weather? But suddenly you're a signed-up believer to homeopathy, and you tell all your friends. So that's why I think we have to be open and honest with what the evidence is telling us, and inform. I think most parents, if they knew the evidence in terms of chiropractic and colic, wouldn't go and see a chiropractor. But what they'll see instead is, I saw yesterday in one of the free newspapers, a full-page advert on the back of the paper, making all sorts of claims about chiropractic, which the majority weren't backed by evidence.
Can I maybe extend that question and ask Simon, do you see any improvement, any way to address this, in improving scientific literacy generally in the community, or is this plummeting to such an extent that it's not really going to help?
I think the problem is that the information all you see is this advert, and the advert says, come and see me and I'll cure this, that and the other. And the assumption is that the evidence must be there somewhere. One of the problems I had with the British Chiropractic Association was that if you looked on their website and you saw their claims, there was a list of what seemed like references, scientific references. One of the references I tried to dig up, and it was in a book, and there was only one book in the entire United Kingdom in the basement of the British Library. And I dug up the book, and it was actually just one paragraph on a 700-page volume, and it wasn't even evidence. But a parent, no matter how scientifically literate they were, wouldn't know this.
They wouldn't.
Yeah. But I think for legislators to come on board would be great, and to start implementing trading standards and advertising standards. There's one blogger in Britain at the moment who's written a piece of software that's gone to every member of the British Chiropractic Association's website. So automatically it just runs out across the web, and it looks for any mention of the word colic. Then automatically it finds the postcode of that chiropractor. Automatically it finds the local trading standards officer. Automatically it writes a letter of complaint. He has to actually go and post the letters manually, but he's submitted 500 letters of complaint. Every single one is going to have to be investigated by the Trading Standards Authority. Everyone should be investigated by the General Chiropractic Council. When a member is being investigated by its own council, they don't have to pay their annual subscription of £1,000, which means £500,000 lost to the General Chiropractic Council. So the sort of job that should be done by the legislators or by somebody is really being picked up by people that just care about evidence and rationalism and so on.